part of it is taking evidence that's already extant and putting it into a narrative. And with regard to that latter point that I just made, if you look at John Brown's rape, for example, 1859 in Virginia, the rape is basically concocted in Canada. It's basically concocted in southern Ontario. The Negroes who were with them were basically Negroes from Canada who have roots in the United States. I talk about one of John Brown's comrades, a heroic Euro Canadian who needs to be better known, Alexander Milton Ross, who probably rescues more Africans from enslavement in Dixie than Harriet Tubman. In part, of course, because of his phenotype, it's easier for him to melt in to the population, white population of the South. And he's in Virginia, in fact, at the time of John Brown's rape. And of course, Osborne Anderson, one of these Negroes, who escapes back to Canada and then writes a narrative about his experience of John Brown's rape. So, I think it's fair to say that if you look at Canada today, and this is somewhat recognized in Canada, this sprawling nation, one of the largest nations by territory on this small planet, but with a population of about a tenth of the size of the United States, and most of that strung along the U.S. border. Canada, as noted, had been the apple of the eye of the Republicans here in small r in the United States for decades, even from the founding of the United States. And one of the reasons why Canada did not fall victim to the United States was not least because of the Negroes with guns, who fought them off repeatedly. And I would say that in terms of the national character of Canada, and if you're familiar with Canada, knows that even though the culture of Canada was rather derivative of the United States, talk about music, that sort of thing, Drake. The politics, part of the national character of Canada is that we are not like the United States. In fact, I think that helped to save them during this Wall Street crisis because they didn't go down the rabbit hole of deregulation in terms of the banks. The banks had more firewalls, and now Canada is doing better financially than most of the other leading capitalist countries. And in fact, I think the Negroes should in part claim Canada because it's a social democracy. I mean, those of you looking for guaranteed health care, all the other amenities of a civilized society, really should think about Canada. And a lot of that has to do with the heavy black presence, well, I shouldn't say heavy, the significant black presence in Canada. It's helped to shape the national character, helped to save it from being gobbled up by the United States. And, you know, I have to say, as a U.S. person, I was just in Toronto promoting this Negro Comrades a few days ago. And you know how it is in the United States. I'm ready to rumble. And you know, in the United States, you're always being harassed. And we're so nasty. So, but you know, when you get to Canada, since it's like you go to Toronto, I mean, it's English-speaking, the accent sounds like U.S., so you tend to expect the U.S. experience. And it takes a while to adjust. Because, you know, as I said, you go, I'm ready, all right, fine. You're nasty, I'm nasty. Let's see who would be the nastiest. But it's always very disarming. It takes a day or two for me to adjust and adapt to the different culture and that respect. And then come across the border and you're ready to rumble again. Yes, any other comments? Well, yes.
No. I want to go back. There's something that you pointed out about the Hawaii text that I think I actually saw anthropology text, which is kind of a critique of anthropology. On the cover, it has two black people on the cover lounging, and you look at it, and when you open the book and you look at who they are, they're from Melanesia.
Yes.
And in fact, the author says he put those people on the cover to make that point. I'm wondering, I'm I'm not sure if you remember, in the early 80s, folks from Vanuatu began coming over and crashing Pan-Africanist gatherings and arguing that they had been left out of this notion of the African world, and identified, remember, Bob Van Leeuwen
Absolutely.
was the representative of Vanuatu.
Black American.
Yes, exactly, in the United States. So I'm just wondering how that plays out in the text, and the work that you've just done. Is there much discussion of it along those lines, besides the labor pieces? Is there anything along the recognition of who they are?
Well, it really figures more than that first book, The White Pacific, which deals with the illegal slave trade in the 19th century. Because as I suggested in that book, I mean, this illegal slave trade was not only to Fiji and to Queensland, Australia. There is evidence to suggest that some of these bonded laborers, Melanesians, might have reached the west coast of the United States. And in fact, since they look like, quote, Africans, quote unquote, there are people who probably maybe Melanesian. I mean, they think they're African Americans, they're really Melanesian Americans. And if you look at some of the indigenous languages, like in Fiji, for example, which has it's very complicated in Fiji right now. Because, as I talk about the White Pacific, in the 1870s, there was a real danger of the United States taking over Fiji, and almost as a defensive reaction, they basically invited the British to block the United States. So they figured that would be worse, which raises part of the theme in this Negro Conference, which is that oftentimes life does not present pleasant alternatives. That is to say, sometimes the options are not between a great option and a bad option. Sometimes the options are between a bad option and a worse option. And it takes a certain kind of insight to opt for a bad option, recognizing that the alternative is the worst option. So in Fiji, after then they invited in the British, then the British started bringing South Asians over. Now you have an Indian, South Asian majority that's led to a lot of political conflict. But in any case, in terms of the indigenous Fijian language, some of the words, a lot of the words in indigenous Fijian language are the same words that are used in East Africa, which has led to the linguistic archaeologists, if you like, to suggest that part of the peopling of Fiji might have been eons ago from East Africa. And of course, this has led to this sort of idea of the South Seas being part of a larger Pan-African community. And certainly, I would say that with regard to the Maori population of New Zealand, which fought the British to a standstill, which is one of the reasons they were much better fighters than the indigenous people of Australia, which is one of the many reasons why the Maori population of New Zealand is about 15% of the population, and New Zealand is officially a bilingual population. And also New Zealand, as you may know, is much more progressive than Australia. And New Zealand, because of its progressivism, that's opened the door for further migration from Africa and elsewhere. You may recall that during the anti-apartheid era, some of the fiercest confrontations in terms of visiting rugby teams from apartheid South Africa took place in New Zealand, which of course they're all blacks. You see the all blacks are very bar dances and intimidates the opponent even before they go on the field. And so New Zealand and the Maori, and interestingly, you may know about one of the reasons when I went to New Zealand, in addition to working on this book, White Pacific, was, as you know, there's this mystery about, what's the guy's name? The god of the nation of Islam. Yeah, exactly. You know, what are his origins? You know, is it South Asian? Is it, there was this idea that he was Maori. And so I was going there to try to see